The fastest shortcut is sometimes the most expensive mistake you will ever make. The first sound I heard that morning was not birds singing over the pasture or the steady breeze moving through the old cedar tree near my front gate. It was the sharp crackle of gravel exploding beneath another set of expensive tires as a white sport utility vehicle raced across my private ranch road without slowing down. Dust rolled through the sunrise like a thick gray curtain, swallowing the wooden sign my grandfather had carved more than 50 years ago. Private ranch road. No public access. By the time the dust settled, the vehicle had already disappeared toward the subdivision on the other side of my property, as if my family's land existed only to save someone 3 minutes on their morning commute. They believed they were borrowing a road. What they never understood was that they were slowly stealing a legacy built one shovelful at a time. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 46 years old, and I own a cattle ranch in Central Texas that has belonged to my family for 3 generations. Every fence post, every limestone rock, every patch of grass has a story older than most of the houses surrounding my property today. My grandfather bought this ranch with money he spent years saving after returning home from military service. He cleared mesquite by hand, repaired broken windmills himself, and built the gravel road leading to our ranch because no one else was willing to do it. My father spent decades maintaining that same road after every spring storm washed pieces of it into the creek. When I was a boy, he used to tell me that a road was more than dirt and gravel. It was trust. It connected family, neighbors, deliveries, and every sunrise that began another honest day of work. I believed every word he said. That morning I stood on my front porch holding a mug of black coffee that had already gone cold while another line of unfamiliar vehicles crossed the entrance one after another. Landscaping trailers bounced over the gravel. Delivery vans ignored the warning signs. Commuters glanced at their navigation screens instead of the property markers standing only a few feet away. Nobody hesitated. Nobody asked permission. They simply followed the vehicle ahead of them as though repetition had transformed private property into public convenience. Then I saw her, Victoria Collins, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. She guided her spotless white sport utility vehicle down my road with complete confidence, one hand resting casually on the steering wheel while sunlight reflected across the windshield. She looked toward my porch for only a second before offering the kind of polite smile that somehow managed to dismiss everything my family had built. That smile lingered in my mind long after the engine disappeared into the distance because it carried a message louder than words. She did not believe she was crossing someone else's land anymore. She believed the neighborhood had already claimed it simply by using it often enough. Standing there beneath the old cedar tree my grandfather planted the year he finished this road, I realized something that changed the way I looked at every fresh tire track cutting across the gravel. They were not just saving time. They were erasing history a little more every single morning. And before another sunrise arrived, I quietly decided that if they wanted to test the strength of my family's boundary, they were about to discover that some legacies are built to stand far longer than shortcuts. People always assume that history disappears when enough strangers pretend it never happened, but history has a way of waiting quietly until someone finally decides to protect it. The morning after I watched Victoria Collins drive across my ranch again, I climbed into my old blue pickup before daylight and followed the familiar gravel road toward the north pasture. The tires made the same steady crunch I had listened to since I was a little boy sitting beside my father on the worn vinyl bench seat. Even after all these years, that sound still reminded me that every inch of this road existed because my family refused to quit when the work became difficult. My grandfather, Harold Walker, purchased this ranch in the late 1960s when most people believed the land was too rocky to produce much of anything. He disagreed. Instead of seeing obstacles, he saw possibilities. With a second-hand tractor, borrowed equipment, and determination that never seemed to run out, he cleared brush, stacked limestone by hand, repaired fences, and slowly carved a proper gravel road from the county highway to the ranch house. There were no contractors. There were no large construction crews. There was only a man determined to leave something meaningful for the next generation. My father inherited that same determination. Every spring, after heavy Texas storms carved deep ruts through the road, he loaded fresh gravel into an old trailer and spent entire weekends repairing damage before another workweek began. As a child, I thought everyone spent Saturdays shoveling rock beneath the hot sun. Only later did I realize most people never had to build the things they depended on every day. My father often parked beneath the old cedar tree near the entrance, switched off the truck, and looked down the length of the road before saying the same sentence every single time. Respect begins where someone else's property starts. He never raised his voice when he taught me lessons like that, because he believed quiet wisdom lasted longer than loud opinions. Years later, after he passed away, I continued the same routines almost without thinking. Every month, I graded loose gravel back into place. Every season, I replaced damaged fence boards, trimmed low branches, and kept drainage ditches clear so heavy rain would not wash away decades of hard work. The road was never just an entrance. It connected every pasture, every barn, every memory, and every promise my family had made to the land itself. Then Willow Creek Estates appeared just beyond my western fence line. At first, the neighborhood seemed like a welcome addition to the area. Families waved as they drove by on the county road. Children pointed excitedly at the cattle. Some neighbors even stopped to buy fresh beef and local honey from the small stand near my mailbox. Those early conversations felt friendly, respectful, and genuinely neighborly. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the subdivision grew larger. More houses meant more traffic. More traffic created more impatience. Someone eventually discovered that my gravel road offered a slightly faster route to the highway, and convenience spread through the neighborhood much faster than courtesy ever had. Standing beside the cedar tree that morning with sunlight breaking across the pasture and another cloud of dust drifting through the air, I realized my grandfather had not spent years building this road so strangers could decide its future. He built it so our family would always know exactly where home began. The first time Victoria Collins walked onto my property, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no for very long. She stepped out of her spotless white sport utility vehicle wearing polished riding boots, tailored slacks, and a navy blazer that looked more suited for a board meeting than a working ranch. The afternoon sun reflected off her sunglasses while a warm breeze carried the smell of fresh hay across the pasture. She smiled politely as though we were old friends, but there was something rehearsed about it, the kind of smile that expected agreement before a conversation even began. "Mr. Walker," she said, extending her hand. "Our community really appreciates this road. It has become such an important part of everyone's daily routine." I shook her hand, nodded respectfully, and calmly explained that the road had always been private property. I pointed toward the weathered wooden sign near the entrance, the same sign my grandfather had carved decades earlier, and told her that the gravel lane existed solely to serve the ranch. She glanced toward the sign for only a moment before returning her attention to me. "People have been using it for months," she replied. "Sometimes communities naturally grow beyond old boundaries." Those words stayed with me long after she drove away because they revealed something much larger than a disagreement about traffic. She was not asking for temporary permission. She believed repeated use had somehow transformed private ownership into shared convenience. Over the following weeks, I noticed small changes that seemed insignificant by themselves, but formed a very different picture when viewed together. Residents from Willow Creek Estates began greeting one another on my gravel road as though it were another neighborhood street. Delivery drivers rolled past my barn without hesitation. Landscaping trailers bounced over the limestone surface before sunrise. Cyclists waved to each other while passing directly beneath my private property signs. Nobody acted disrespectfully on purpose. In fact, most people looked completely comfortable because they genuinely believed they belonged there. That confidence did not happen by accident. Community newsletters frequently discussed the fastest routes through the area. Online neighborhood conversations praised the convenient drive to the highway. New families followed navigation applications that simply repeated the pattern established by everyone before them. Convenience slowly replaced curiosity, and curiosity is usually what causes people to ask permission. One afternoon, I replaced my aging wooden sign with a larger steel version mounted securely into concrete. Bright reflective letters clearly read Private Ranch Road. No public access. 3 days later, someone had covered part of the wording with colorful community event flyers. I carefully removed them without saying a word and cleaned every inch of the sign until it looked brand new again. A week later, the sign had disappeared completely. When I asked Victoria whether the homeowners association knew anything about it, she calmly answered that nobody could be expected to monitor every resident. She then added that perhaps clearer communication would help avoid future misunderstandings. I realized then that we were no longer discussing missing signs or traffic. We were discussing two completely different ideas of ownership. To me, property lines represented responsibility, history, and respect. To her, daily convenience seemed capable of rewriting boundaries that had existed for generations. As another evening settled across the ranch and the last commuter disappeared beyond the cedar tree, I stood quietly beside the empty signpost, listening to loose gravel settle beneath fading tire tracks, and understood that the real challenge was no longer convincing people where my land began. The challenge was reminding them that some boundaries cannot disappear simply because enough people pretend they already have. By the beginning of summer, I stopped measuring the problem by the number of vehicles crossing my ranch and started measuring it by everything those vehicles quietly changed. The gravel that my father had carefully maintained for decades developed deep ruts much earlier than usual. Fine dust settled across the fresh water troughs every afternoon, forcing me to rinse them before the cattle gathered for evening feeding. The calves that normally wandered peacefully between the north pasture and the lower meadow began hesitating whenever another line of vehicles appeared, their ears turning toward unfamiliar engines before slowly drifting away from the fences. None of it looked dramatic on its own. That was exactly why so many people failed to notice it. Small changes rarely attract attention until they become impossible to ignore. I knew that raising my voice would accomplish nothing. If anything, it would only reinforce the idea that I was an angry rancher refusing to cooperate with the growing community next door. Instead, I decided to become patient. Every morning before sunrise, I installed a new trail camera near the cedar tree overlooking the entrance. A second camera watched the narrow bridge crossing the seasonal creek. A third overlooked the section where tire tracks consistently left the deepest impressions after heavy rain. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted facts that could not be argued away. Each evening, I downloaded the footage onto my computer and labeled every folder with the date and time. I created a notebook that never left my desk. Inside, I recorded the approximate number of vehicles, weather conditions, delivery trucks, landscaping trailers, construction equipment, and anything unusual that affected the property. When fresh gravel needed replacing, I saved every receipt. When heavy traffic delayed feed deliveries because large trailers had to wait for commuters to clear the road, I documented the arrival times. Even routine maintenance became part of a growing record. The more information I collected, the calmer I became. Facts have a way of replacing frustration with purpose. A few days later, one of my neighbors from outside the subdivision stopped by with homemade peach cobbler and quietly asked whether I had considered contacting the county. I smiled and thanked her for the dessert, but told her I was not ready yet. There was still something missing. Opinions could always be challenged. Assumptions could always be dismissed. I wanted evidence that would speak for itself without requiring emotion or exaggeration. Meanwhile, Victoria continued acting as though everything was perfectly normal. Community newsletters praised the neighborhood for improving local connections. Residents posted cheerful photographs online of morning bicycle rides and scenic drives that happened to include my ranch road stretching toward the sunrise. Nobody mentioned that the road belonged to someone else. Nobody seemed interested in asking why it had been built in the first place. Watching those posts never made me angry anymore. Instead, they quietly confirmed what I had already begun to understand. The real dispute was not about gravel, traffic, or convenience. It was about perception. If enough people repeated the same story long enough, they hoped it would eventually replace the truth. Fortunately for me, property records do not care about popular opinion. Cameras do not forget what they record, and patience often builds a stronger foundation than outrage ever could. As another evening settled across the ranch, I closed my notebook, backed up another day's recordings, and looked out toward the cedar tree, realizing that every passing vehicle was no longer strengthening their argument. Without realizing it, they were steadily strengthening mine. The following Monday, I drove into the county seat before the courthouse doors even opened, carrying a weathered leather folder that had belonged to my father. Inside were faded property maps, handwritten maintenance notes, old tax receipts, and the original warranty deed that my grandfather had carefully protected for decades. The woman behind the county records counter smiled politely when I explained why I had come. She had processed land documents for years and never seemed surprised by anything anymore. She entered my parcel number into her computer, compared it with the original survey on file, and then disappeared into a secure archive before returning with several large rolled maps that looked almost untouched by time. We spread them across a wide wooden table beneath bright overhead lights. Thick black lines marked every property boundary exactly as they had been recorded generations earlier. My ranch road appeared clearly inside my parcel from the county highway all the way to the ranch house. There was no shared access agreement. There was no recorded easement. There was no public right-of-way. Every legal document told the same simple story. The road belonged entirely to my family. I asked her whether there had ever been amendments or later filings that changed those boundaries. She searched once more, checking neighboring parcels, historical transfers, subdivision records, and planning documents connected to Willow Creek Estates. After nearly half an hour, she gently closed the final file and looked up at me. "Mr. Walker," she said, "nothing here gives the subdivision legal access across your property." Hearing those words did not fill me with excitement. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief because the truth had not changed despite months of assumptions spreading through the neighborhood. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant document along with updated parcel maps and ownership records. If I was going to protect my family's legacy, I wanted every fact supported by official paperwork instead of memory alone. On the drive home, I stopped at a licensed surveying company that had worked throughout the county for years. The owner listened carefully while studying the county maps and agreed to visit the ranch later that week. When Thursday arrived, 2 surveyors unloaded professional equipment from their truck and spent the entire day locating original boundary markers that had been placed decades earlier. One by one, they uncovered iron pins hidden beneath layers of grass and soil, confirming measurements that matched the county records almost perfectly. By late afternoon, the lead surveyor handed me a preliminary report and smiled. "Your grandfather knew exactly where his property lines belonged," he said. "Everything is still right where it should be." Standing beside the old cedar tree while fresh orange survey flags stretched along the edge of my land, I suddenly saw the ranch differently. Those bright markers were not creating new boundaries. They were simply revealing boundaries that had always existed. The passing vehicles continued rolling across the gravel exactly as they had every day before, completely unaware that the foundation of their confidence had already begun to disappear. They believed habit had become ownership. I now held certified records, verified surveys, historical deeds, and professional measurements proving otherwise. For the first time since this entire situation began, I stopped wondering whether I could protect the road. The only question remaining was how to do it in a way that respected the law, honored my family's work, and settled the matter permanently without raising my voice even once. Once the survey markers were in place, everything became surprisingly simple because I finally understood that I did not need a courtroom, an argument, or a neighborhood meeting. I only needed to exercise the rights my family had legally possessed for more than half a century. The following morning, I called a local civil engineer whose company had designed agricultural entrances throughout the county. He arrived with rolled blueprints, a measuring wheel, and enough practical experience to recognize exactly why I had asked him to visit. We walked slowly from the county highway to the old cedar tree while I explained the history of the ranch, showed him the certified survey, and handed him copies of every official document I had collected. He studied the property lines carefully before looking back at me with a thoughtful smile. "Everything you want to build can stay entirely inside your boundary," he said. "As long as we follow county requirements, nobody can honestly claim you are blocking anything that belongs to them." Those words carried more weight than he probably realized. For the first time, I could clearly picture a solution that relied entirely on preparation instead of confrontation. During the next several days, I visited the county planning office, completed permit applications, reviewed setback requirements, and confirmed every measurement twice before signing a single page. The employees answered my questions professionally and never suggested I was doing anything unusual. Property owners improved ranch entrances all the time. The only difference was that most projects were not quietly solving months of growing conflict. After receiving approval, I met with a respected local contractor who specialized in limestone construction. We stood together beside the entrance discussing materials while morning sunlight warmed the weathered fence rails. Instead of choosing something temporary, I selected heavy native limestone that matched the natural landscape surrounding the ranch. A black powder-coated steel gate would sit between two wide stone pillars, strong enough to last for decades, while blending naturally with the land my grandfather had worked so hard to build. The contractor nodded with obvious appreciation. He said the entrance would look as though it had always belonged there. That was exactly what I wanted. Nothing flashy, nothing hostile, just something permanent, dignified, and unmistakably private. Throughout the planning process, I never mentioned Victoria Collins or the Homeowners Association. There was no reason to. Every conversation focused entirely on engineering, permits, drainage, visibility, and long-term maintenance. Even the construction schedule reflected ordinary ranch improvements. Trucks would arrive early. Stone would be delivered in stages. Concrete foundations would cure before the gate installation. Every step followed standard procedure without shortcuts. Meanwhile, traffic continued flowing across my gravel road exactly as before. Commuters hurried through each morning. Landscaping crews bounced over the bridge, and cyclists waved cheerfully beneath the cedar tree without noticing the bright survey stakes or the utility. Markings beginning to appear near the entrance. They believed another ordinary week was passing. I knew something very different had already begun. Standing on my porch one quiet evening, I watched the setting sun cast long shadows across the gravel road my grandfather had built with his own hands. For months, I had been gathering records, preserving evidence, confirming boundaries, and choosing patience over frustration. Now every permit had been approved, every measurement verified, every plan finalized, and every piece of stone ordered. I smiled to myself because the solution was never about building the biggest entrance in the county. It was about creating one clear boundary that respected the law so completely that no opinion, no assumption, and no amount of repeated convenience would ever be able to move it again. Construction began on a cool Monday morning just after sunrise, and for the first time in months the loudest sounds on my ranch were not impatient commuters rushing toward the highway, but skilled craftsmen carefully laying the foundation for something that had been planned with patience instead of emotion. Flatbed trucks rolled through my entrance carrying massive blocks of native limestone, while the contractor directed each delivery with quiet precision. The scent of fresh concrete mixed with cedar and cut grass as excavators prepared the footings entirely inside my surveyed property line. Every measurement was checked against the engineer's drawings before another shovel of concrete was poured. Every stone was positioned exactly where the approved plans required. There were no surprises because surprises only happen when preparation is missing. By the second afternoon, the first stone pillars had begun rising from the ground, and passing drivers noticeably slowed to watch the transformation. Some smiled politely. Others looked confused. A few stopped along the county road to take photographs before continuing toward the subdivision. Nobody approached the construction crew because there was nothing unusual about a ranch owner improving his entrance. Everything changed on Thursday morning. I was speaking with the contractor beside the cedar tree when a familiar white sport utility vehicle turned off the county highway and rolled toward us before stopping a safe distance from the work area. Victoria Collins stepped out wearing the same composed expression she always seemed to carry. She glanced from the stone pillars to the steel gate resting on a trailer before looking directly at me. "Ethan," she said calmly, "I hope this is only decorative because people rely on this road every day." I returned her greeting just as calmly and explained that the project had been fully permitted, professionally engineered, and constructed entirely within my property boundaries. I even showed her the survey markers that had guided every measurement since the first day of construction. She studied the orange flags stretching beside the gravel road, but appeared far more interested in the gate than the documents supporting it. "This is going to create problems for the neighborhood," she replied. I simply nodded and answered that I understood her concern, but had spent months making certain the project complied with every applicable county requirement. There was nothing personal in my voice because there did not need to be. The paperwork already spoke much more clearly than either of us could. She thanked me politely before returning to her vehicle and driving away without another word. Construction continued exactly as scheduled. The limestone walls gradually extended outward from the entrance, blending naturally into the existing ranch fencing. Black steel hinges were installed with careful precision, followed by a heavy ranch gate that swung smoothly on its reinforced posts. When the final section was secured in place, the contractor handed me the keys with a satisfied smile. "This entrance will probably outlast both of us," he joked. I looked through the open gate toward the familiar gravel road disappearing beneath the old cedar tree, remembering every morning I had watched strangers treat it as though history could simply be driven over enough times to disappear. Late that afternoon, the county building inspector completed his final review. He walked the entire entrance, verified setbacks, compared measurements with the approved permit, and signed the inspection report without requesting a single correction. Before leaving, he shook my hand and congratulated me on building one of the finest ranch entrances he had seen in years. As his truck disappeared down the county highway, I closed the steel gate for the very first time. The quiet click of the latch echoed across the pasture, gentle enough to sound almost ordinary, yet powerful enough to mark the exact moment when months of preparation finally became something that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, the ranch was quieter than it had been in months until just after 7 o'clock, when the first white sport utility vehicle turned off the county highway exactly as it always had. The driver slowed only when the new limestone entrance came into full view. For a brief moment, the vehicle remained motionless in front of the closed steel gate, as though the driver expected it to open simply because it always had before. Then the brake lights flashed, the vehicle carefully turned around, and it returned to the highway without a single horn or angry gesture. Over the next hour, the same scene repeated itself again and again. Pickup trucks, delivery vans, landscaping trailers, and commuters all reached the entrance, paused in surprise, and quietly found another route. Some rolled down their windows to study the stone pillars. Others read the new bronze plaque mounted beside the gate, identifying the entrance as Walker Ranch Private Access. The message was respectful, simple, and impossible to misunderstand. Shortly before noon, Victoria Collins arrived. She parked beside the county road and walked toward the entrance carrying a folder beneath her arm. I met her outside the gate with the same calm expression I had maintained throughout the entire project. She explained that several residents were frustrated because their daily commute had suddenly become longer. I listened without interrupting, then handed her a neatly organized binder containing copies of the certified survey, the recorded deed, the county permits, the engineer's drawings, the final inspection approval, and photographs documenting the construction process from beginning to end. She slowly turned each page without speaking. Every document carried official signatures, dates, and county seals. There were no opinions inside that binder, only verified facts. After several quiet minutes, she closed it and looked toward the gravel road disappearing beneath the old cedar tree. Before either of us could continue, a marked county vehicle pulled into the shoulder near the entrance. The deputy stepped out, greeted both of us politely, and explained that the department had received several calls asking whether access had been blocked illegally. He reviewed the permit documents, compared the survey markers with the completed entrance, and walked the property line himself. When he returned, his conclusion was straightforward. The entrance had been built entirely within private property, fully complied with county requirements, and did not obstruct any public roadway or recorded easement. He thanked both of us for remaining cooperative and wished us a pleasant afternoon before driving away. The conversation changed immediately after that. Victoria no longer discussed public access or neighborhood expectations because there was nothing left to debate. Instead, she quietly admitted that many homeowners had simply assumed the road belonged to everyone because it had been used so often. I answered that assumptions become dangerous when they replace simple questions and mutual respect. She nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, and for the first time since we had met, the confidence that had once surrounded every conversation seemed replaced by genuine reflection. During the following week, the Homeowners Association distributed an updated community notice directing residents to use the public county routes instead of crossing private ranch property. Online neighborhood discussions gradually shifted from complaints about the longer drive to conversations about respecting local landowners. Standing beside the cedar tree one peaceful evening, I watched the setting sun shine across the untouched gravel road stretching toward my barn. The dust had settled. The traffic had disappeared. Nothing about the ranch felt louder than before. It simply felt like home again, protected not by arguments or anger, but by preparation, patience, and a boundary that had finally been recognized for what it had always been. Several months have passed since the morning I closed that black steel gate for the first time, and sometimes I still find myself standing beneath my grandfather's old cedar tree before sunrise, listening to a silence that feels different now. It is not an empty silence. It is the sound of a place finally being allowed to exist exactly as it was meant to. The gravel road stretches from the county highway toward the ranch house, without fresh commuter tire tracks crossing its surface. The cattle wander calmly between the pastures again, no longer pausing every few minutes at the sound of unfamiliar engines. Delivery trucks arrive on schedule without waiting for lines of morning traffic to clear. Even the dust settles differently now, drifting gently across the limestone entrance instead of hanging in the air behind dozens of passing vehicles. The ranch feels as though it has taken a long, steady breath after months of holding it in. Every so often someone from Willow Creek Estates stops by the front gate, not because they expect to drive through, but because they want to ask permission before entering the property. Most are genuinely kind people who simply followed a habit they believed was acceptable. We talk for a few minutes about cattle, weather, or the history of the ranch, and I usually point toward the cedar tree while telling them about my grandfather building this road with borrowed equipment and endless determination. Almost every visitor leaves with the same response. They had never known the story. That realization taught me something important. Respect often begins with understanding, and understanding usually starts with a conversation that should have happened much earlier. Even Victoria Collins changed over time. A few weeks after the neighborhood updated its community guidelines, she stopped by one quiet afternoon carrying a small box of locally made pecan pie. She smiled, not with the confidence I remembered from our first meeting, but with the humility that comes from seeing a situation more clearly than before. She admitted that convenience had slowly become more important than curiosity, and that the homeowners association should have confirmed the property boundaries instead of assuming repeated use created shared rights. I thanked her for saying so because acknowledgement is sometimes more valuable than winning an argument. Before she left, she paused beside the limestone entrance and said it looked as though it had always belonged there. I smiled because that had been my goal from the very beginning. The gate was never meant to keep good neighbors out. It was built to protect a promise made generations before either of us ever met. Every time I drive through those stone pillars, I think about my father reminding me that respect begins where someone else's property starts. As a boy, I believed he was talking only about fences and land. Now I understand he was really talking about people. Boundaries are not walls built out of anger. They are quiet reminders that every family, every home, and every legacy deserves the same consideration we hope others will show our own. Looking back, I never defeated anyone. I simply allowed the truth to stand where it had always stood, supported by patience instead of pride, preparation instead of frustration, and facts instead of assumptions. The old cedar tree still shades the entrance every morning just as it did when my grandfather planted it decades ago. And whenever the first rays of sunlight touch the limestone pillars, I am reminded that real justice rarely arrives with loud celebrations. More often it arrives quietly, one careful decision at a time, until the truth becomes impossible to drive around and impossible to drive through.